very clear. My presidency will not be a continuation of Joe Biden's presidency.
Kamala Harris's deeds suggest that she is not fit to represent the state of Pennsylvania. She's not fit to serve as president of the United States of America.
The path that Sinwar wanted for the region, death, destruction, instability, chaos, is a path that we know the people of the region reject.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Vice President Kamala Harris is in Wisconsin today, making stops in Milwaukee, La Crosse, and Green Bay. This is her 6th visit to the state since she launched her presidential bid. Tim Walz and former President Bill Clinton campaigned in Durham, North Carolina this afternoon. And tonight, the Democratic VP pick will be joined by rapper Common in Winston-Salem. Now, early voting is now underway in North Carolina, despite devastation from Hurricane Helene complicating the casting of early ballots. Long lines are forming early in many parts of the state, including in storm-ravaged Asheville. And former President Donald Trump is in New York City tonight for the Al Smith Dinner, which benefits Catholic charities. The election year tradition will be in person again this year after a hiatus due to COVID. The former president will be there in person, but Kamala Harris will deliver pre-taped remarks. But first, it has been a major focal point of this campaign cycle, the unrest in the Middle East. Today, Israeli officials confirm Hamas leader and October 7th architect Yahya Sinwar is dead. It could be a major turning point in the Israel-Hamas war. So let's begin with CBS News foreign correspondent Ramy Inocencio in Tel Aviv.
Confirmation
of the death of the mastermind of the October 7th terror attacks came from Israel's foreign minister following DNA testing. On Wednesday, the Israel Defense Forces killed Hamas's top leader, Yahya Sinwar, and 2 others in a raid in southern Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said evil suffered a heavy blow, but the war is not over. Last month, the Justice Department charged Sinwar and other Hamas figures, saying they financed, directed, and oversaw a campaign to murder U.S. citizens and endanger U.S. national security, orchestrating killings and kidnappings. The parents of U.S. and Israeli hostage Omer Nutra released a video statement.
This is a critical, time-sensitive development as it relates to the hostages. Their lives are in great danger now, more than ever.
Vice President Kamala Harris commented on the death following a campaign event.
Justice has been served. And the United States, Israel, and the entire world are better off as a result.
The October 7th attacks that killed more than 1,200 Israelis launched the war against Hamas that has killed 42,000 Palestinians, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. The conflict has also spread to Lebanon. Ramy Inocencio, CBS News, Tel Aviv.
And earlier today, Vice President Harris explained how this assassination could impact or should impact the war moving forward.
This moment gives us an opportunity to finally end the war in Gaza. And it must end such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination.
Let's head to the campaign trail. Ed O'Keefe is in Wisconsin with the vice president, and Bob Costa is covering former President Trump in New York. Great to see you both. Thanks for being here. Ed, I want to start with you. As Vice President Harris has been speaking about Sinwar's death today, as we just heard in that clip. What more are you hearing from her campaign and from the White House?
Yeah, the developments in the Middle East today scrambled her campaign schedule and focus a bit, Caitlin. She was making those comments while at a business school in Milwaukee where she was set to meet with students, and she did, but they kept reporters out of that meeting, instead having them set up for that statement that she delivered instead, trying to refocus it just a little bit and allow her to make that statement to cameras even before President Biden landed in Germany tonight and was able to speak out on behalf of the United States. That statement she makes, though, about how Sinwar's death now should allow this war to wind down, the hostages to be released, and humanitarian suffering to be eased in Gaza and across the Palestinian community in that region, is designed to assuage the real anger of Arab American and Muslim American voters in this state and in Michigan, two key battlegrounds where this issue has really hurt her politically. There were students in the streets on that campus today loudly protesting her position on the war. When we were in Detroit earlier this week, we met with a local imam, and I asked him very just simply, what's she got to do to win around here? And he said, you got to stop Netanyahu. You got to keep calling out Netanyahu's, as he put it, misbehavior. The more she does that, he said, the better off she'll be in trying to convince these people to turn out. So her team understands there's real domestic political pressure on her as that crisis in the Middle East unfolds.
Yeah, and Bob, I mean, as we mentioned and as Ed just explained, I mean, this is a huge issue on the campaign trail as well. I'm wondering if the Trump campaign has weighed in at all.
Former President Trump's here in New York City. He's going to address a Catholic gathering, the famous Al Smith dinner tonight. He's also sitting for an interview with another news organization, and he is certain to weigh in at some point later today based on my conversations with people close to Trump. But to build on Ed's reporting, you're seeing in all of the tensions in the Middle East, Israel's fight with Hamas and Hezbollah, a real focal point on foreign policy in this closing stretch of the campaign. And the Trump campaign for a long time believed that the war with Ukraine that Russia was waging was going to be the main issue on this front. But ever since October 7th, it has come to the fore. And Trump has always put himself forward in his presidency as someone who is an advocate for Israel and has had a relationship with Netanyahu that's been complicated, but he has been largely someone who sees himself as able to convince Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, to come along on certain issues.
Ed, you are in Wisconsin today, and anytime I think of a Democrat in Wisconsin, I can't help but think of all the criticisms that Hillary Clinton got for not campaigning there enough. I'm wondering how much of that is on the Harris campaign mind, but mostly what is her message to voters there?
Yeah, 3 stops today in Wisconsin. As we mentioned, Milwaukee this morning. She's about to begin an event at La Crosse, the University of Wisconsin La Crosse. And then she's coming here to just across the street from Lambeau Field, where the Packers play, to rally with a few thousand supporters. This is a smaller event by the scale that we've seen her hold in some of the big states since she became a candidate, but it's designed to reach a part of the state where maybe Democrats don't do as well, or would know that if she comes just a few days after Tim Walz was here, that perhaps it can gin up enough support ahead of early voting and then eventual voting on Election Day. So yes, this is in essence a lesson learned from the Clinton years. You have to be here. And with various surveys continuing to show this statistically tied, showing Tammy Baldwin, the incumbent senator, in a dogfight as well with her Republican opponent, the more that the campaign spends time in this state, the better it can be in organizing those they need. You've got an interesting mix of older and more union household types in this crowd so far for an event that doesn't begin for another 90 minutes or so. Earlier today was a focus on younger voters and an explicit focus on the economy. She's also campaigning today with the businessman Mark Cuban, who's become a bit of a surrogate and advisor on economic issues, someone who has, cross-partisan crossover appeal with other parts of American society. Maybe don't pay as close attention to politics, but certainly know who he is. So he's serving today as a validator here in this battleground state.
And Bob, you are in New York City tonight for that Al Smith dinner. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and why this is typically an important stop for presidential candidates?
It's an important stop because it's hosted by the Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Timothy Dolan. And throughout American political history, since Al Smith's rise in New York politics a century ago, it has been a place where candidates come every 4 years and crack a few jokes at each other's expense, banter with the cardinal, whomever it is at the time, and make their appeal to Catholic Americans, a key voting demographic in many of these battleground states. And you see in Vice President Harris a campaign that is certainly engaged with Catholic voters across the country. She is giving remarks there that have been pre-recorded. She will not be in person tonight at the dinner. Some conservative commentators have criticized Vice President Harris for not being there, but she's on the campaign trail in Wisconsin, her allies say, and that's in no way a sign of disrespect, they tell me. It's just a campaign scheduling issue. At the same time, former President Trump wants to make sure Catholic voters are coming out, especially as he tries to talk about IVF and abortion rights in a way, and he's done that in interviews like he did with you, Caitlin, where he wants to make sure that has a broad appeal, even though he is the president who nominated justices to the Supreme Court who ultimately overturned Roe v. Wade. He doesn't want to be seen as an arch conservative necessarily by every swing voter on this issue, but he also doesn't want to lose Catholic voters who might take a conservative position on abortion rights, opposing abortion rights, and wanting those who want to see more restrictions. So it's a delicate balancing act politically for former President Trump.
Yeah, we will look for the headlines coming out of that dinner and out of Wisconsin. Bob and Ed, on the campaign trail, thank you so much for both of your time. And we also have new polling out of Arizona. Let's bring in CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. All right, Anthony, I've been so curious about what this new polling is finding in Arizona. Where does the race stand here?
Hey there, Caitlin. Let's head to a southern battleground state, right? So here we have Trump at +3 in Arizona. But what's really interesting about the state is that you've got at least 3 really interesting races. And we're here to show you they're all a little bit different. This is the presidential, and let me show you the issues and the way that Donald Trump has an advantage for people who say both the economy and the border. And look at the size of that advantage, right? It's almost 8 and 10 for Donald Trump, who said the border is a major factor. A couple of things that stand out behind that, right? One is straight up on policy. More of these voters think that Donald Trump's policies, if he wins 7 and 10, would decrease border crossings. But then, he's talked about on the campaign trail this idea of deporting all folks who are in the U.S. illegally. And look at the number of Trump voters in Arizona who support that idea, at least in principle, 93%. So that's behind partly of his lead. But I want to show you this, too, because abortion is also on the ballot here. The right to abortion, that is actually leading at 52%. It's running ahead of Kamala Harris. One reason for that, although the votes for her and for that are connected in some way, and you might think, well, she has a big advantage because she does on the issue for people who say it's a major factor, but this is what's limiting. The perception among voters, among a slight majority of voters, that were Donald Trump to win, he would leave abortion up to the states. And I suspect that if the Harris campaign is successful at moving the needle on the issue, that's the number to watch. As long as the majority still thinks that Trump would leave abortion to the states as opposed to trying to pass a national abortion ban, then maybe she becomes limited in how far that issue can take her, even with that proposition on the ballot.
Yeah, that's a question we've had in Arizona and other states where ballot measures are on the same ballot as the presidential race. Anthony, that's fascinating data there. Also in Arizona, I know we've been talking about the presidential race, but they have a really key Senate race there between Ruben Gallego, who's a current congressman, and Kari Lake, the Republican. What's the latest there? I got to show you this. Gallego with a much more sizable lead here, the largest of the two. He's running ahead of Kamala Harris, right? And he's running well ahead of Kari Lake. A couple of things here that really strike you. One is we do this measure we have for a few years of which candidate you think you describe as reasonable or extreme. And look at the split here, just in general. Now, of course, different things that can mean different things to different people. But Gallego at 60, reasonable, and Lake at almost 60 as extreme. And then this part, which somewhat relates to it, right? The people who are voting for Donald Trump in the presidential, majority of them say it's because they like Donald Trump. But Lake's vote here is much more spread out, including a lot who say they're because she's the party nominee, and fewer who say because they like the candidate in particular, which again helps explain why Lake is running so much behind Donald Trump right now. That is a very interesting dynamic to watch, and whether that gap closes as we get closer. Anthony Salvanto, as always, thank you for bringing this to us. And Vice President Harris is promising that if elected, she will govern differently than President Biden. Next, Harris Wall's campaign co-chair Cedric Richmond joins us to discuss the state of the race. You're streaming America Decides.
My presidency will not be a continuation of Joe Biden's presidency. And like every new president that comes into office, I will bring my life experiences, my professional experiences, and fresh and new ideas.
And that was Vice President Kamala Harris claiming that if elected, her administration will be different. She went on to tell Fox News that she represents, quote, a new generation of leadership. Harris-Walz's campaign co-chair Cedric Richmond joins us now. Great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. So I want to talk a little bit about that quote. What specific policies is the vice president differentiating herself from President Biden?
Well, I'll tell you, President Biden had a different game plan and strategy and policy than President Obama. And Vice President Harris is going to deviate from President Biden. And I'll give you 3 areas that I could think of right now. If you look at her health care plan, by allowing seniors to get home health covered by Medicare so that they can stay in their homes, they can help with that sandwich generation where you're caring for a kid and a parent, she's going to provide help there. And that is a significant relief for those families that are being burdened by health care costs and the cost of senior living. Another one is housing. Housing is an incredibly expensive cost for people right now. President Biden wanted to do it over 8 years. Kamala Harris has decided she's going to do it in 4 years and build 3 million new housing units by partnering with the private sector, reducing red tape, and creating those public-private partnerships so that we can get it done and bring housing costs down, and also offer a $25,000 incentive for those first-time home buyers to purchase the American dream. And she's also articulated that she would have a Republican in her cabinet, and that is to, one, because we don't have a monopoly on good ideas, and also to bring the country together, unify the country, but 3, to start moving forward and not just living in the past, which Donald Trump wants to do. So that's 3 right there.
I do want to ask you about the outreach this week to black male voters. This seemed to be, obviously an overt strategy by the Harris campaign. How concerned are you that this group is not going to turn out in the numbers that they did for Biden in 2020?
Well, I'll say a couple things. First of all, over 80% of African-American men are with Kamala Harris, and that's an incredible number. But you don't get them by default. You don't get them automatically. You have to talk to them. And they deserve to know what you're going to do for them and answer the question of what's in it for me? What does the future look like if you win for me? And that's what she's doing. And by the way, she's been meeting with African-American male leaders on African-American male issues for over a year now, well before the campaign started and well before she was the nominee. So we have to go out and earn every vote this election. We talk about seniors. We talk about rural America. We talk about women and their reproductive freedoms. And we're talking to African-American males about the opportunity for them to take their future in their own hands. And that is to vote for the candidate who represents the best future for you. So we laid out an agenda to show them her economic plan, her health plan, her entrepreneurship plan, all of those plans that would affect them and lead them to this new opportunity economy and a more prosperous and more perfect union for them. And so I think it was a smart move, and we were answering the question that many African-American males have been asking, which is, what's your plan for the black community? What's your plans for African-American males? And we answered it with a very substantive plan.
I mean, former President Obama seemed pretty concerned as well, and he also seemed to suggest that there's some sexism at play here. Do you agree with his approach to this group and what he said?
Look, President Obama is a former president of the United States of America, and I think what he was highlighting was the opportunity for African-American males to be co-architects of their own future and to take their destiny in their own hands by showing up to the polls, voicing their vote, or letting their vote be their voice. And I think that was what he was, that's what he was attempting to talk about. And look, he was very direct, and he has a right to do that as a former president. But I think the bottom line was he was really pinpointing and putting an exclamation point on the fact that African-American men have an opportunity in this election to be the margin of difference, to be game changers, but more importantly, to take their future in their own hands and let their voice be heard.
And I want to ask you just quickly, I know Harris is on a tour of the blue wall states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Those are key states, of course, but we also have this new polling in Arizona where where Donald Trump, I should say, has a slight edge. Can you win without Arizona? How concerned are you about the conditions in that state right now?
We have multiple paths to victory, but we always said that this was going to be a close race. We also said that Vice President Harris should be considered an underdog. But I will tell you this, if you look at the battleground states, all the states are pretty much within the margin of difference. They're all a toss-up. That's why you see Vice President Harris leaving it all on the field. She's on Fox. She's on Charlemagne. She's going everywhere to talk to people. She's meeting the voters where they are to talk to them about her vision for the future and what she believes is in their best interest in terms of moving this country forward, not going backwards. And I think that we expect a close race, and we're going to go out there and fight for every vote. And we're going to do it by talking about a vision for America and moving this country forward, uniting it. We're not going to do what President Trump is doing, which is talking about revenge and talking about enemies within and turning the federal army on its own citizens. And I think it's a very stark contrast of the two candidates. And we have a little over, 18, 19 days to go make the case to the American people about why Kamala Harris should be the next president of the United States.
All right, it is a toss-up race indeed. Well, Cedric Richmond, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And a highly anticipated report on the July assassination attempt on former President Trump has finally been released. What the panel behind it determined and the extensive changes to the Secret Service that it's demanding. You're streaming America Decides. An independent panel tasked by President Biden to review the July assassination attempt on Donald Trump is calling for the Secret Service to undergo fundamental reform. In a letter with the report made public today, the panel said it, quote, uncovered not only numerous mistakes that led to the events of July 13th in Butler, but also deeper, systematic issues that must be addressed with urgency. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, to whom the letter was addressed, says his department will consider the panel's recommendations. Secret Service Acting Director Ronald Rowe also released a statement saying the agency will carefully examine the report. Our own Nicole Skanga joins us now in our D.C. studio for more. So, Nicole, I know you went through all of this in this report.
All 52 pages.
All 52 pages. You read it, so we don't have to. But essentially, what specific failures did they identify that the Secret Service made?
In terms of July 13th missteps, one of the facts that stuck out to me is that the site agent that was assigned to Trump's detail to plan out security for the rally had minimal experience doing advance work prior, and according to the report, quote, certainly nothing to the level of Trump's rally in Butler. Trump's detail also, we learn, was not even aware of Thomas Crooks, this despite the fact that law enforcement had identified the gunman, though they did not know he was armed, a full 90 minutes before the former president took that podium. And so, again, that lack of communication, a strong theme throughout this report. And along those same lines, radio calls from local law enforcement warning that Thomas Crooks had a long gun did go out about 30 seconds before Crooks first got his shots out. But those calls were never received by the U.S. Secret Service because they were on different communication channels, different radio channels. One of the other big points is just that the Secret Service's counter-drone technology, which typically can detect and deter other drones, was not up and running, which, of course, now we know that Crooks had flown a drone over the site for about 11 minutes on the same day.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating, the kind of infrastructure failures there. But the panel also was very critical of the Secret Service for what they said a lack of self-reflection in the wake of this.
Yeah, this was
what exactly does that mean?
Really scathing report, and the panel used words like bureaucratic, complacent, and static to describe the current state of the U.S. Secret Service, warning the Homeland Security Secretary in that letter you mentioned that if fundamental reform is not taken, those steps are not taken, Butler can and will happen again. So sort of stark terms there. The panel also saying that agents operated under the assumption that they could do more with less in terms of resources. And it cited a troubling lack of critical thinking among the ranks of the agents. So one of the examples that it cites is multiple officials recognized there were line of sight issues in terms of, where a possible threat could be within 1,000 feet of the podium. Of course, now we know crooks got within 400 feet of that podium, and yet no one took ownership of the problem and addressed it.
I mean, Nicole, I know we're 3 months removed from that assassination attempt, but these details in this report are just extremely, they raise even more questions. I know you'll be following it all. Nicole, thank you so much for your reporting. We appreciate it. And Vice President Kamala Harris's interview with Fox News is drawing intense reactions from both sides of the aisle. Ahead, our political panel will share their thoughts on the sit-down. You're streaming America Decides. And we're continuing to follow the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, as reported by Israeli officials. President Biden says DNA tests have confirmed the longtime commander is dead. President Biden just landed in Berlin, and that's where we find our own Willie James Inman. Willie, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So how is the president responding to Sinwar's death here?
Hey there, Caitlin. Good evening to you from Berlin. President Biden landed here just moments ago, and he spoke with members of the press about Sinwar's death. He essentially talked about how he called President Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, and congratulated him on the death of this terrorist that many have been looking for quite some time. I want to play some sound, and just bear with us as you take a listen to President Biden there on the tarmac.
Now's the time to move on. Move toward a ceasefire in Gaza. Make sure that we move in the direction that we're going to be in a position to make things better for the whole world. It's time for this war to end and bring these hostages home.
And the president is also sending his Secretary of State to Israel in the next few days to perhaps discuss a path forward in terms of a ceasefire. The president was asked if he's hopeful a ceasefire will come about. He said that he's hopeful, and he also said that he hopes that an end to the war can come soon, with Sinwar no longer in command of Hamas and Hamas leadership essentially decimated there in Gaza.
All right, Willie, major news today, and we'll see what this means for the Israel-Hamas war. Thank you very much for your reporting. We appreciate it. And back here, Vice President Kamala Harris is campaigning across the battleground state of Wisconsin today, one day after she sat down for what some are saying is the most adversarial interview of her campaign. Our political panel joins me now to discuss yesterday's sit-down with Fox News and much more. Braxton Booker is national political correspondent for Politico, and Finn Gomez is our CBS News political director. Gentlemen, great to see you both. Braxton, I want to start with you. I want to play a clip from Harris, her sit-down with Fox News last night. This is essentially about her campaign wanting to turn the page.
You've been vice president for 3.5 years. So what are you turning the page from?
Well, first of all, turning the page from the last decade in which we've been burdened with the kind of rhetoric coming from Donald Trump that has been designed and implemented to divide our country.
So she's talking about turning the page from Donald Trump, and I think a lot of Trump supporters want to turn the page from the Biden administration. But this seems like a way for her to kind of thread the needle there. What did you make of it?
Yeah, definitely threaded the needle, but I think overall the sit-down with Fox News was beneficial for her because she had not had a really adversarial interview in a while, right? Like, she had a couple of interviews with some major networks where she was critiqued for not having some clear, more concise answers to what some folks thought were some simple questions about, what were going to be some of the first policies that she was going to implement. Sitting with that interview with Bret Baier showed that she could not only take a punch, but also kind of push back a little bit with some really tough questioning in an environment where she knew she was not going to get sort of this cakewalk of an interview. So I think she performed pretty well. But to your point, yes, she was threading the needle, but you are starting to see that she is starting to create a little bit of distance between her and the Biden administration.
Yeah, I mean, one of those tough questions, Finn, was on the issue of immigration, which we know is a top issue for voters in some of the battleground states, but especially for Trump voters. I want to play a little clip of what she had to say there.
We have a broken immigration system that needs to be repaired.
So your Homeland Security Secretary said that 85% of apprehensions.
I'm not finished. We have
it's a
an
rough
immigration
estimate of 6 million people
that
have been
needs to be-
released into the country. And let me just finish. I'll get to the question. I promise you.
I was beginning to answer. The first bill, practically within hours of taking the oath, was a bill to fix our immigration system.
Yes, ma'am. It was called the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021.
Exactly.
It was essentially a pathway to citizenship for the. Yes, ma'am.
May I finish responding, please? But you have to let me finish.
You
please.
had the White House and the House and the Senate,
I'm
and they didn't bring up that bill.
I'm in the middle of responding to the point you're raising, and I'd like to finish.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So, Finn, I'm curious what you make of that exchange.
Well, I think it actually is somewhat reminiscent of that famous 2020 line. I think it was a good moment for her. Yes, it was a pugilistic interview, but that "let me finish" line I thought was a strong one. Look, she didn't give all that many details in that response, I thought, and it definitely wasn't, I think, what many in the Fox viewership would wanted specifically. But I think, as Braxton said, I think that she more than held her own. I think she did what she had to do, and also because frankly, Donald Trump said no to a debate, right? Another debate, and also there was an effort, there was a strategic effort to appeal to moderate Republicans who are on the bubble in these crucial battleground states, and I think she did that effectively last night.
Yeah, not necessarily trying to appeal to that audience, but showing that she can do those sorts of interviews. I mean, we'll see how it's assessed by the public and, of course, whether this moves any votes. I also want to play, it was a tale of lots of interviews, town halls this week. I want to play some sound, Finn, from Trump did a town hall with Univision. And here was a really notable question from a voter there. Let's take a listen.
What happened during January 6th and the fact that, you waited so long to take action while your supporters were attacking the Capitol.
You had hundreds of thousands of people come to Washington. They didn't come because of me. They came because of the election. They thought the election was a rigged election, and that's why they came. Some of those people went down to the Capitol. I said peacefully and patriotically, nothing done wrong at all, nothing done wrong.
That's a pretty big statement, right? This was done out of love, or an event of love. Curious what you both make of that exchange.
Yeah, I was there on January 6th. It was not a day of love, But I think it's something that another journalist who writes for Politico, Adrian Carrasquillo, said yesterday is that in Harris campaign panels with voters, this is registered. January 6th is registered high with Latino voters, bigger than I think that many expected. For some, it's reminiscent of. That day was reminiscent of what they've been seeing in some of their home countries, countries of origin, where you do see some of these, attacks on the leadership and respective governments. So I think it was really telling. And by the way, I think that construction worker, that moment has gone viral. Yes, I was about to say that. And he said it wasn't answered to his liking. Yeah, well, just the facial expressions alone have been amplified on social media, showing that this answer was not satisfactory. If you thought that answer was satisfactory, then maybe you don't want to vote for Kamala Harris. But if you felt like that answer could deliver for you, then, I mean, that is a gold mine that the Harris campaign and their influencers are really leaning into right now.
And I know you were just reporting in Detroit. I know you've been covering Harris's campaign. I'm curious if you think kind of those moments, I mean, I noticed that she started to play clips at her rallies. I'm wondering if this might also be continuing.
I can see that certainly being played at a rally. But yeah, the folks in Detroit really want, they really want to see her a lot more in the flesh. Like she's been doing, and I've been having some reporting on this, that she's been doing a lot of kind of small, intimate gatherings, and they really want to see her a lot more in some of these bigger rallies where they can feel like they can touch, they can feel. Even when she was doing her interview with Charlemagne, it was a closed-off viewing party, and she also was doing it from a studio that a lot of folks didn't know that was happening. So this weekend in Detroit, when she returns, I think a lot of people are going to be excited to actually see her and feel the energy of her campaign.
Pounding the pavement in those blue wall states, they'll help determine who wins this whole thing. Braxton and Finn, I know you'll be following it all for how many days?
19 days.
19 days until Election Day, but states are already voting. So, well, thank you both. According to new polling, middle-aged voters, women, prefer one candidate in particular. Who that is and what the new numbers say, that's next. You're streaming America Decides. A new survey from Marie Claire finds middle-aged women prefer Vice President Kamala Harris over former President Trump. 49% of women between the ages of 40 and 60 preferred Harris compared to 41% for Trump. So let's bring in the executive editor of Marie Claire, Andrea Stanley. Her magazine helped to conduct that survey. It's great to see you, Andrea. Thanks for being here. I'm curious about this survey and this group in particular, because I think it's a really undercovered group. And I'm wondering, too, with the issue of reproductive rights kind of front and center of this campaign in some ways, I'm wondering if this group had any reaction to it. How important was the reproductive access to this group?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I completely agree. We found this group to be very much understudied and overlooked. And yet they wield real power when it comes to the election because they are in so many different phases of their life. Some of them have toddlers at home, some have teenagers, some have grandchildren. And so we thought that their perspectives on these issues were really important to understand their motivation for getting out to vote. And certainly reproductive health care came up in our findings. In fact, 2/3 of women ages 40 to 60 disagree with the Dobbs decision, which is the Supreme Court case that overturned Roe versus Wade. And if you put that into contrast with the larger poll, only 51% of men disagreed with the Dobbs decision. And we heard that they were worried for themselves, for their daughters, for their grandchildren. And they aren't just looking for a candidate who is going to address these issues on a state level, but they're really looking for someone who is going to affect change around abortion policy on the federal level. So I think it's very telling that reproductive health care and abortion access specifically are certainly a motivating factor for women in this age group.
Yeah, and your survey also found that women in this age group actually don't have a lot of hope for the future of this country. That was pretty striking to me. Why is that?
Yeah, it was certainly very striking to us, too. The majority of people who responded to our survey reported that they did not have a hopeful sense of the future of the country. And if you parse that data even further, 55% don't have a lot of hope for the future of the country in terms of what their children are going to inherit. And, we heard from women all across the country, and there were, myriad reasons for this. They're worried about climate change. They're worried about gun reform legislation. They're worried about reproductive access, as we just discussed. But the one issue that they really coalesced around was the economy. It was the number one issue that they were worried about by far. And it makes sense. Former President Donald Trump has run a campaign that is very much centered around the country not being in as good of a place as it used to be. And that certainly was exhibited in our data. 95% of Republicans in our survey did not feel that the country is headed in a good direction. But I think in addition to that, it's something that affects women's lives in a very real and tangible way. And we heard that too. 74% of survey respondents between the ages of 40 and 60 feel that they are having more trouble affording basic necessities today than they were before. So it's certainly a very motivating factor for women as they're thinking about how they want to vote this election cycle.
Yeah, such an undercovered group and such nuanced views of these big issues we've been talking about all cycle. Andrea Stanley, thank you so much for this. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And voters began casting their ballots in person in the battleground state of North Carolina today. We're in the Tar Heel State next. You're streaming America Decides. Early in-person voting is now underway in a second battleground state after kicking off in Georgia earlier this week. Now, voters in North Carolina began heading to the polls today. More than 400 voting locations are currently open as the state continues to recover the damage from Hurricane Helene. Shauna Maisel is in Durham, North Carolina for more. Shauna, good to see you at a campaign rally there. Talk to us a little bit about the significance of North Carolina in this election overall.
Hey, Caitlin, good afternoon. It's great to be with you. Well, North Carolina is one of those crucial battleground states that we have been following this entire election because there are going to be 16 electoral votes up for grabs. Now, this is a state that voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020. In fact, Obama was the last Democratic candidate to win this state, and that was in 2008. So it's certainly a state that we will be following and watching closely. And as you mentioned, early voting just got underway today.
And Shauna, you have been covering the Tim Walz campaign. I know you've been following him all around the country, and that's where you are right now. He's in North Carolina for 2 rallies, including one with former President Bill Clinton. Can you tell us a little bit more about this event and what the campaign hopes the former president, Bill Clinton, brings to the ticket?
Yeah, so if you take a look right behind me, there's Governor Tim Walz, but actually sitting on stage is former President Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton was actually out on the campaign trail last week in Georgia making the case to voters, and the Harris campaign is essentially hoping that former president, his name recognition and his approval within the community can help boost them come November.
And Shauna, you are covering this campaign very closely. What do the next few stops look like? And we see Tim Walz on our screen there.
So Tim Walz is actually going to be heading to Nebraska. Nebraska is a state where folks have said it could all come down to that state. Should Harris and Trump tie for 269 and 269 electoral votes, there will be 1 vote up for grabs in Nebraska. Now, Tim Walz is actually from Nebraska, so he'll be there in the Cornhusker State on Saturday, but we're also going to expect to see Walz and Harris in those other battleground states like Georgia and Wisconsin. And in fact, in addition to former President Bill Clinton being here, Tim Walz will be joined by former President Barack Obama at a rally in Wisconsin next week.
All right, trying to get out that vote in the final stretch. Shauna Maisel, thank you so much for your reporting. And as we told you earlier in the show, Vice President Harris is choosing to stay on the campaign trail rather than attend tonight's Al Smith dinner. So we thought it was only right to show some of the most iconic moments of the event in previous years. Now, this is a tradition that began in 1960 when John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon appeared together. Opponents have used the occasion to break bread after bruising campaigns. Here's a look back at some of those moments.
You can't shake that feeling that some people here are pulling for me. I'm delighted to see you here tonight, Hillary.
Earlier today, I went shopping at some stores in Midtown. I understand Governor Romney went shopping for some stores in Midtown.
But it's nice to finally relax and to wear what Ann and I wear around the house.
There are a lot of friendly faces here in this room, people that I've been privileged to know and to work with. I just want to put you all in a basket of adorables.
Michelle Obama gives a speech, and everyone loves it. It's fantastic. They think she's absolutely great. My wife, Melania, gives the exact same speech. And people get on her case.
Some good moments there. Well, if you're ever asked for some reason at a political trivia night, what is the only year that both candidates were not invited? Well, here's the answer. It was Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, and the year was 1996. Well, that does it for us today, but we'll be back with another edition of America Decides Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.